Hello, everyone. We have a couple of speakers that are still to join us. One is now coming. That's great. We should have one more that will be coming a little bit later. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Liz Hart. I am the project director for the Targeting Natural Resource Corruption project at the World Wildlife Fund here in the US. I'm very pleased to have been asked to moderate this session that's being led and organized by the Basel Institute, who's been a very important partner for us in the project. We're here to talk about the role of financial investigations in strengthening enforcement and deterring wildlife and other environmental crimes. It's a bit of a technical subject, but one with critical ramifications for biodiversity by reducing the opportunities and attractiveness of corrupt actions and other illegal actions that facilitate illegal wildlife trade and other environmental crimes. As you can see, we're going to have a lot of perspectives on this today, but I think we have some good topics to cover with the panel that we have. But to start us off, I'd like to introduce Dr. Graziella Marok-Wachter, who is the Minister for Infrastructure and Justice of the Principality of Liechtenstein. And Dr. Marok-Wachter, the podium is yours.
Well, thank you, Madam Moderator. Dear panelists, dear participants, I would like to welcome you all to this panel discussion jointly hosted by the Basel Institute and Liechtenstein. We have a very long and very successful partnership with the Basel Institute, a true champion in the fight against corruption. It is thus a pleasure for me to launch this panel discussion with outstanding speakers on an issue of great importance: how to follow the money to fight environmental crimes. Environmental devastation as a result of criminal activity is already a defining challenge of our time, and it is growing to unparalleled levels. Estimates from Interpol and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime put the total illicit gains from environmental crime at a staggering 110 to 281 billion US dollars per year. What does such figures mean? Of course, they represent estimates, and no estimate is certain. But without any doubt, the scale of the problem is catastrophic. Such figures also mean that finances are crucial to addressing environmental crime. While we tend to underestimate the impact of environmental degradation on our climate, on biodiversity, or on our health, our legal systems commonly seek to put a price on the losses that such crimes cause and assign punishments on that basis. With this in mind, it is clear that figuring out the finances of environmental crimes is key to developing an appropriate response. In other words, financial investigations need to be a central element of the law enforcement response to environmental crime. Here are some brief examples to show how much international policy converges on this issue. In 2017, G20 leaders recognized the link between wildlife crimes and corruption and called for the tracking of such financial flows. Only a few weeks ago in Bali, G20 leaders highlighted the importance of international standards to fight systemic corruption and environmental crimes, recognizing their grave impact on economies and societies. The UN General Assembly has urged states to treat illegal wildlife trade as a predicate offense for money laundering. The FATF has encouraged states to conduct parallel financial investigations into illegal wildlife trade and similarly into mining, forestry, and waste trafficking. The OECD, for its part, has recommended bringing in financial intelligence units in follow-the-money investigations related to wildlife crime. These examples show the strong policy momentum we have on this question. Now we have to build actual capacity to follow the money as a prerequisite to investigate and prosecute environmental corruption. We have to put an end to environmental criminal syndicates operating with impunity on a high profit and low risk business model. Prosecutors have an important role in that regard. The necessary legal tools and investigative techniques should be put to the disposal of prosecutors in order to combat environmental crime. Parallel financial investigations focusing on both the environmental crime and the connected money laundering offenses are an effective tool to identify larger criminal networks and disrupt financial flows. Liechtenstein is actively engaged in discussions to strengthen the role of prosecutors to address environmental crime. The Council of Europe is an important forum in that respect. The follow-the-money approach has been successful in fighting transnational organized crime in other areas. It is at the core of the FAST initiative to mobilize finance against slavery and trafficking. We are convinced it will be successful here as well. That is why Liechtenstein has been a donor of the Basel Institute's Green Corruption Program for the 3rd year running. Next year, we will see a focus on bringing together practitioners engaged in tackling environmental corruption through financial investigations in cooperation with USAID. This is a joint project between World Wildlife Fund, Traffic, Transparency International, and the Basel Institute, launched yesterday here at the IACC. I invite everyone interested to join forces and participate. We understand that follow-the-money approaches are complex and will not be established overnight. Robust discussion is required to ensure that the rollout of such approaches is as effective as possible. The IACC is a perfect platform for that. Accordingly, I'm looking forward to experts' discussion about the achievements and the remaining obstacles, making financial investigations an effective tool that can be mainstreamed by environmental enforcement agencies around the world. I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Madam Minister, for those remarks to get us started here today. And thank you so much for mentioning the Practitioners Forum that we launched yesterday. We hope that all of you who are interested in collaborating across the conservation and anti-corruption worlds will join us tomorrow at lunchtime in the embassy room for a further discussion at about 1 o'clock. If you're interested in learning more, you can also contact us for some information here. Thank you again, Madam Minister. To start our conversation with the panel that we have here, I'd like to invite our last panelist also to join us on the dais, Gladys Kamasunyu, to come up and join us here, and then we'll launch our discussion. And Gladys, while you're joining us, I'll direct my first questions to my colleague at the World Wildlife Fund, to tell us a little bit about where you see the importance of financial investigations in the fisheries sector. You lead a program on fisheries crime at WWF, so give us a little context on the fisheries sector and also on your role as a former prosecutor and having dealt with complex crimes against the environment. Where do you see our challenges in implementing financial investigations?
Clearly, the first challenge is figuring out how to work the microphone. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle Curick, and thank you very much, Liz, for passing that first question to me. I am a former government prosecutor, but I've also worked at international institutions. I worked with the UN in Rome on fisheries crime, and now I work for WWF. So I've kind of got, I would say, sort of a differing and unique perspective. But I don't know very much about you. So before I sort of launch into my important data points to share, let me ask you, is there anyone in the audience who is familiar with prosecuting crimes dealing with fisheries? Okay, overwhelming here. Okay, all right, very good, thank you. All right, just don't call me out if I say something crazy, okay? All right, well, so the reason that I asked that question was because I was interested to see if it would be useful to learn just a little bit about fisheries so you can sort of understand the context in which some of these cases may take shape and the direction that they go or don't, sort of what happens to them. So fisheries globally are, Madam Minister, as you properly let us know, are one sector that has been very attractive to organized crime. There is a lot of money to be made in fisheries. Obviously, it's a legitimate commodity. In fact, it's the most widely traded food commodity in the world. In the United States alone, it's on target this year to import about $30 billion, that's with a B, billion, dollars worth of seafood and fish products into this country alone. So, and it has a history of incredibly weak regulation. It's a prime formula for organized crime targets, and they haven't overlooked fisheries. Even though it might look very unappealing to many people, it isn't. It is highly profitable. And, as you rightly said, the risk of detection is low. In addition, there are typically very, very few cases that have actually been brought around the world where fisheries violations form the heart of a high-level criminal prosecution. There's probably, in every system, there's probably a lot of different reasons for that, but oftentimes when investigators put an evidence package together, presumably, if it's a complex case, it'll have elements of financial investigation involved. But you come into a prosecutor's office, and most prosecutors have no idea what to make of a fisheries case. They maybe will get one in their career, maybe, and that's usually because they say something like, yeah, I like nature, I like to go out hiking, and then suddenly the investigators say, okay, target that guy. But that's not an unusual situation. Most countries do not have specialized units for prosecuting these types of cases, so they go into the general mix with everything else. That's an important point for both sides to remember, that they go into the general hopper with everything else, because most of the time, these situations are not strictly fisheries only. They absolutely often involve money laundering or false statements, all sorts of things that could also be very familiar to prosecutors. Maybe not necessarily always to a fisheries investigator, who probably have spent much of their career, figuring out the different forms that the products come in, what they look like, what the trade patterns are, what sorts of things are expected and normal, and how things differ from that, where their effort and suspicion should be. But that's an important thing. I'm not sure, Scott, exactly what you're going to say, and if you're going to say, nope, not my experience at all, but I guess my experience has been that between both the investigators, the prosecutors, and the judges who hear these cases, sometimes really big ones, maybe they'll have one in their entire multi-decade career. And there's usually no, how do we even say this? Like performance advantage for doing a case that might take 5 years or 10 years and involves fish. Most of the time, your supervisor is not going to be saying, wow, that's great. But when we think about the alternative, letting these kinds of offenses continue to proliferate. And illegal fishing is common around the world in developed and developing countries. It is present in literally every fishery that exists. So there's nobody, no country, not this one, not other highly capitalized countries that have managed to avoid fisheries violations. They exist everywhere. And part of that, and Ben and I were talking just very briefly a second ago about how complex the fisheries supply chain is. I don't know what you know about fisheries, so I know you don't prosecute fisheries cases. I don't know if you eat fish. I don't know if you've thought about fish, where you get it, where it comes from. But it's not the romanticized view typically of the single fisherman who goes in his boat offshore on a day trip and brings it back to the dock, and you get it at the fish market fresh off the boat. Yes, that certainly describes some, but not most of the fish that is prevalent in international trade. It makes a complicated journey across the world from typically where it's caught. There are certain places in the world where fish supply is relatively still abundant. Many have been fished out because of human consumption for the most part. But beyond that, there are places where labor is very inexpensive, where fish is sent to be processed. And that journey can touch many, many, many different jurisdictions before the fish ultimately comes to market. Even though, if you're looking at country of label origin in your supermarket and it might tell you it comes from one country, that's only typically the last country that product touched. It is not necessarily equivalent to the vessel that caught it, the place where it came to port, the place where it was processed. Those regulations tend to be a little confusing. But it is a complicated supply chain. Am I already getting like okay, you got to stop talking here. Okay, I think so. Soon. Okay, all right. All of this really is to say that the area that we're talking about today deserves a tremendous amount more energy and attention to make sure that the health of the oceans in the long run is preserved, that we don't eat it out. I mean, that sounds a bit crude, but our appetites are tremendous. Our populations are growing, and the middle class in general is expanding and looking for more protein diversification, and oftentimes that's exactly where they look. They look to fish. And so to the extent that cases dealing with complex financial investigations are necessary, to the extent that any of you have the opportunity to take on or encourage or promote work like that, I hope you can. They are very similar to the types of cases that probably come to your door right now. They just happen to deal with a different commodity, but one that's important for many reasons for all of us. Okay, I'll stop.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michelle, and I'm sorry I didn't introduce you at the beginning. Michelle Keurig, Vice President for Oceans Policy at WWF in the U.S., and a good colleague of mine. Michelle has set a good scene for us in terms of the challenges related to doing these financial investigations, why it's difficult from within the prosecutorial organizations themselves, but also why it is so important in the context of the markets and the environment that we're talking about. Next up, for another perspective on this, is Ben Brock, wildlife crime analyst for Traffic, the wildlife monitoring organization. Ben, in your work tackling wildlife crime and transnational organized crime, both with Traffic, and it's important for everyone to know that you were previously also with the UK National Crime Agency, so you have some track record there. What role have financial investigations played in the wildlife space and the wildlife crime space? And maybe share with us some of the challenge for a more widespread adoption of financial investigation.
Thank you very much. So it's quite an interesting transition to go from a law enforcement agency dealing with exclusively with transnational organized crime, all the things you think of, guns, drugs, people trafficking, to then coming over to an NGO focused on the illegal wildlife trade. The thing that became immediately apparent to me is the types of groups we're talking about are remarkably similar. The transnational organised crime groups that move in cocaine, that move heroin, look very similar in the practices, the way they behave, to the ways we see these illegal, natural resources being exploited and used illegally. So, looking at the role of financial investigations, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. From my time with the NCA, we tried a lot of different ways to disrupt large. When we look at these types of organised crime groups, they'll be multi-generational. They're people have come up. The next generation will inherit it. They are established across a range of different countries. They'll have people who fill almost ambassadorial roles. They'll go to a different country to improve the relationships. And what we had there was, even though we would be very structured with our arrests, with our prosecutions, and we would seek not to just put individuals into prison, we'd try and put a whole section of senior management, if you like, into prison in one go to disrupt it. Frequently, all you would happen is you'd accelerate promotion from below, or you would get diversification from the next city over, and people would very quickly fill that gap. The great thing that we saw about using financial investigation, I'm specifically thinking of the heroin trade in London, was that when we actually were successful in using financial investigations, we disrupted these groups long term because it's acquisitive. They're there for the money. The people who are selling it in the UK, they owe money there to their suppliers further up the supply chain. And if you keep taking out the money, you not only damage the motivation, but you take away their ability to do this. You take away their ability to pay bribes. You take away their ability to buy companies that they will then use as fronts. And it's not just about a single financial investigation. There's a whole host of techniques that make that effective. One of the ones that we saw work very well was targeted cash seizures. So the drugs groups, they make a lot of cash. They often will have a relationship with a specialist money laundering group. They will go over to them, they hand the cash over to them, and then they'll go away and launder it. They take their cut, and they return the laundered funds down the line. What we found was that the money laundering groups are so professional, they guarantee losses. So if law enforcement seizes the money post-handover, they say, don't worry, you're good, the ads are bad, we'll make good the money for you. And so what we needed to do was to seize the money before it went to the cash handover, and then the money laundering groups, potentially quite rightly say, well, that wasn't on our watch. We hadn't taken possession of it at that point. That's still yours. And something that's true of the drugs trade, and I think natural resource corruption, is the profit margins are so good that taking out the contraband en route, I've literally listened to a trafficker say he can lose 9 out of 10 shipments and still be profitable. So we're not going to attack these groups by taking out the shipments. By taking out the money, it then means that they can't buy the next shipment. And they may have an established enough relationship that they can get the next shipment on tick or on credit. But they might get the second one, they won't get the third one. And it just drives them out of business. So that's the good news scenario. And that's the good news scenario when you've got a very well-resourced, international, motivated, financed agency behind you. Moving over to financial investigations against the illegal wildlife trade, we don't have that. And it's quite frustrating to see that we're talking about billion-dollar crimes. We're not talking about, this is not like, oh, it's a few trees, it's not a big deal. No, fish, forest, whatever you like to, whichever part we pick, we are talking, the estimates go from 50 billion to 100 billion. They are huge amounts of money, and it hasn't been a law enforcement priority to this point. And so you don't get the long-term intelligence collection strategies put into place. You don't have the large investigative teams set up to pursue it. They don't have the structures to do controlled deliveries and everything that follows around that. So I do think that financial investigations could be enormously effective in tackling the natural resource crimes. But we really need to do a lot to get natural resource crimes, natural resource corruption, actually where it should be in the top 5 criminal threats that most countries do face. And I think probably at that point, that's probably enough from me.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ben, for kind of bringing us down into the details of some of the investigations and giving us a look of what that looks like when you're trying to do it inside a prosecutorial agency. I'm next going to turn for some perspective to our good friend Louise Shelley, who will win the prize for the longest title and job position. Louise is the Omer L. and Nancy Hurst Endowed Chair and a university professor at George Mason University. She is also the moving force behind the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center at the university, and TRAC has been a good partner of the Targeting Natural Resource Corruption Project. Louise, you are a consistent voice, I think, at identifying and uncovering and casting light on illicit trade around the world. And you have certainly, in your book on dark commerce, you've outlined in great detail the illicit financial flows of wildlife trafficking, among other criminal networks. So can you tell us about a couple of the main kind of obfuscation techniques that criminals use to avoid their money being traced, and maybe also if you have any reflections on what you've seen about who's doing it well and what else needs to be done?
Thank you for the fun introduction, Liz. Can you hear me in the back? So I asked Johanny, what should I speak about? So he says, talk about your book. But I have something more recent. And I see Layla standing in the island. She's part of the scientific committee that did this. So we had a grant, we still have a grant, from the National Science Foundation to look at illicit supply chains, not in reference to the environment. We have been working on counterfeit masks. You're saying, well, what the hell are you talking about? Counterfeit masks in a meeting on environmental crime. So in targeting these illicit supply chains, we came across a company that was selling counterfeit masks in large quantities. And it was a lumber company. And the red, the flashing lights go on in my head. And I say, we have a company that was sanctioned in the United States named Lumber Liquidators. And maybe, there's a history in some parts of this lumber industry of the supply of legitimate companies of being involved in illicit trade. So if we're looking at a bunch of cases, let's take a look at this one. I don't know, some of this may still be investigated, so I won't go into too many details, and there's some hilarious details in this case. But one thing that we should think about is not only about the criminals, but the intersection with companies and legitimate companies. So just as Michelle was talking about fishing, it intersects with large-scale fishing companies. We have illegal timber trade, and at one of the previous IACC, there was a movie called Borneo, which was about the deforestation of Borneo, and the highways and roads to do this were funded by Goldman Sachs. So when we look at the supply chains for this, we should be looking not just at the criminals, but where they intersect with the legitimate world. And some of them are very powerful actors. So but it's knowing that helped us zero in on this lumber sales company that turned out to be one of the major suppliers of counterfeit masks. And then what do we say? How does science, because we're talking about being financial investigators. Well, I'm not a financial investigator. I know something about it, but there are professionals in this room. But I think it's very important to understand the role that researchers can play in this. And this research that we did that found this company, and it was also an illegal, timber business, was done through very advanced data analytics. And it required all kinds of understanding of using AI, using tools, using trade data to find how this counterfeit supply chain was linked with this timber company. This is not the only case of really scientific analysis being used to go after financial crime. There's a wonderful center by Professor Wasserstrom in Washington that does genetic analysis of elephants that allows people to look at the illicit supply chains and the sources of the elephants that are being traded. So when we think about the financial analysis, we should think of how science and large-scale data analysis can contribute to this financial analysis. And then the last point that I want to make is that, and we have people who are specialists on this in the room, is trade-based money laundering. And we're talking so much about either cash transfers or transfers through banks, but a lot of our payments processes for illicit wildlife, for timber, for gold, are going on in terms of trade-based money laundering. And one of my favorite movies in the environmental area is called Sea of Shadows, that won a Sundance Award for its popularity. And that showed how the Totoaba fishing and destruction of the fishing off of the coast of Baja California is being used to help pay for the drug markets, so that the synthetic drugs that are being imported into Mexico are sometimes being paid for by the timber that's being harvested in the Amazon, by the fish that are coming out of the sea. And so you've got to think of these very complex relationships where you can't just follow the money and the cash, but you need to be looking at the trade patterns. And so what I'm telling you that we found, and this became an actual case that's been pursued by the US government, comes from understanding the role of convergence, the role of private companies, the role of science, and the centrality of trade-based money laundering to the field of environmental crime. Thank you.
Louise, thank you so much for kind of bringing us to some broader connections between the illicit flows of funds and the illegal wildlife trade and related environmental crimes, and what else is going on in the illicit world. We know that there's too much and there are too many connections most of the time for us to really just take this from one perspective. We need to be working on it across a lot of different perspectives. I'm going to change our perspective here for a moment and go from global international trade to what is actually happening in courtrooms in Uganda. And we are extremely pleased to have with us Gladys Kamasanyu. I'm sorry I didn't pronounce your name so well the first time. Gladys is the Chief Magistrate of the Uganda Wildlife Court, and this is one of the only dedicated wildlife courts, I believe, in the world. May have overstated that a little bit. But Gladys, tell us a little bit what you see in the courtroom about the assets of from wildlife traffickers or from the proceeds of wildlife crime, but also what is the role of financial evidence? Are you seeing enough financial evidence? Do you need to see more financial evidence? How do you see this as a judge receiving a case?
Thank you. I'm happy to be here this evening. As judges, we sit at the end. We only receive that which has been prepared, and actually we give back what we get. We don't perform miracles. There's no miracle in court. You basically get back what you brought, and that will be the evidence that we'll receive, that will make basis for the decision that we give. From my experience at the Wildlife Court of Uganda, that I have a benefit of heading, and this cannot only be happening in Uganda, I know in most of our countries, especially from the continent of Africa. I think there is still a lot of excitement when we effect arrests. When we grab somebody, we want to run away with them, and we are happy to arrest them with the illicit wildlife products, and we know we have a good case, and we say, yeah, we have him, or we have her, and we rush to conclude investigations to only prove the unlawful, we'll say, possession of the illegal, of the illicit wildlife product, and we go and prove that. Many times we do forget to carry out those very important financial investigations to help in making this person not profit from the illegal trade that they are carrying on. Many of them have a lot of wealth that they actually benefit from even after serving whichever term of imprisonment. As long as it's not life imprisonment or death, they will come back and find their wealth. And I am aware that not so many countries today have life imprisonment or death or very long custodial sentences in their domestic laws. And that is another area that we are still battling with. And I'm happy to report here that Uganda is one of now the countries that have, I think, the best wildlife laws. Our 2019 Act actually does provide for very deterrent sentences, including a life imprisonment for illegal wildlife trade. And last month we had a benefit of handing down the first life imprisonment sentence that has been making rounds on social media, and we have had very different reactions about it. So what we want to see, we want to see more financial investigations, and this will depend on how much we're given to actually carry out proper investigations, obtain good evidence about these financials, but also the ability to put the evidence before a court, to convince court to give us those orders that we want to have, so we may be able to go after the illegal profit that the traffickers and all those who participate in illegal wildlife trade have gained. So, and this calls for more effort, care as we effect arrests. There are those pieces of evidence that may give clues to perhaps one's wealth that we may not take as important. I've had complaints on law enforcement officers arresting traffickers and they forget to take their phones away. By the time they remember to take the phones, they are no more, they've hidden them. There are gadgets like laptops and all others, because some of them think those are not important, and they abandon them, say, at the scene, or they let them be treated as personal property. And there are also challenges of actually the capacity to actually carry out some of these investigations, because they are really, really complex sometimes. I have had cases before me where enforcement officers could not even access the Apple laptops that traffickers carried, and that was it. They couldn't access them, they couldn't open them, and the traffickers refused to open them. So you can imagine the iPhones that they had, they remained and were treated as their personal property, and they couldn't do much. So there's still a lot to be done to achieve what we want, but all hope is not lost. At least we are here today. We still have the energy. We are together. And as we all know, to fight illegal wildlife trade calls for all our collective efforts. And for me, I'm sure that we are moving to the right direction.
Gladys, thank you so much, and also thanks for the hope, because this is an extremely complex set of issues, as we've heard already. And just to complete the picture or add one more element to the picture, we'll move on the map again from Uganda back to the US. We've heard from investigators, we've heard from prosecutors, we've heard from judges, researchers, but there's another crucial agency, and that's the Ministries of Finance, or in the case of the US Treasury, with a crucial role to play. Here in the US, we did see this year the first sanctioning of a wildlife trade violation group, a group involved in illegal wildlife trade. And this is just one tool in the arsenal that finance ministries have. So we're very pleased to have with us Scott Rembrandt, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Strategic Policy at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. And Scott, just tell us a little bit about what Treasury is thinking and doing on this complex issue right now.
So thank you very much for having me. It's a real honor to be here, and thanks both for the Basel Institute and also everyone's leadership, and also Liechtenstein, your leadership efforts. And I have to say, being in this hotel, it's both it's humbling and it gives me hope. And I say that because in the last 20 years I've spent time working in the private sector and the public sector, and split my time. You go back 15 years ago in East Asia and Southeast Asia, and then New York and Washington in the private sector, and then back to Washington for the government. And 14 years ago, I was here with my wife and then 6-month-old son, and this is where he started to learn how to swim. And I mention this because I think of all the hope you have as a parent, sort of to raise your children to be moral adults, and also the humility you have to have. You can only control so much. So with my remarks, hopefully they'll be both a bit humble and also hopeful. To table set, I think from a finance ministry perspective, we look at the systemic gaps and vulnerabilities that allow all types of illicit finance, be it trade-based money laundering, transnational organized crime, or terrorist financing, to move through the U.S. and international financial system. And I think it is very important from our broader perspective, unless we have strong anti-money laundering frameworks in our country and countries around the globe, we cannot successfully, from a systemic perspective, tackle wildlife trafficking and its illicit finance. That sort of underpins it. And I see the FATF President, Raja Kumar, which you want to wave, is in the audience. And we at the U.S., we spend a great deal of time with a lot of our international partners at the Financial Action Task Force working to build effective anti-money laundering regimes in our own countries and to hold other countries to account. And the way the FATF has set up its system of grades for countries, it has basically 11 categories. And for countries to successfully combat wildlife trafficking, I think you need to have success across a lot of those categories. Do you understand the risk, particularly in your own systems and its financing? Do you have effective international cooperation, both finance ministry and law enforcement? Do your banks and financial institutions know what the risks are? Do you have a beneficial ownership registry, where some of the corporate information of companies, shell companies they're misusing, available? Do you have an effective financial intelligence unit where this information can be analyzed? Do you have effective money laundering investigations and prosecutions? Do you have effective asset forfeiture and confiscation? Absent these core components of the AML CFT regime, it's very hard to be effective to combat any types of money laundering, including related to wildlife trafficking. I think, so about what we're doing about it, just to put it succinctly, one, we have worked with many members of the Financial Action Task Force on a couple reports that the FATF issued, one on illegal wildlife trade, the other on environmental crimes, and they had three big takeaways. One is that as relates to financial investigations, they need to start early in any law enforcement investigation before the money moves. Two, there needs to be a prioritization of parallel investigations, investigating the predicate crimes and also the money laundering. And three, strong encouragement for countries to include in their national risk assessments the risks related to wildlife trafficking. So I guess in a minute or less, how the U.S. from a financial ministry approaches this. One, as best practices, we need to work hard to provide guidance to our financial sector on what to look for in terms of illicit wildlife trade and also other environmental crimes. And we've done that in a number of ways. One is, as part of our national risk assessment, there's a small chapter that relates to illegal wildlife trade. Two, thanks to FinCEN, our Financial Intelligence Unit, and Ann Martin, if you're in the audience, you want to wave your hand, who runs part of FinCEN's Intelligence Analysis Unit, has analyzed suspicious activity reports and publicized, related to illegal wildlife trafficking and also environmental crimes, and publicized what they've learned to industry. So one is providing guidance to industry on what they need to look for. Two, is providing feedback to the private sector specific to illegal wildlife trade or environmental crimes so they can operationalize what finance ministries and financial intelligence units know. In addition, three is the use of authorities, sanctions-related authorities that the U.S. has employed. You mentioned one of our actions. We have a range of authorities that allow us to take basically sanctions actions related to illegal wildlife trade or environmental crimes, provided there's a nexus to human rights violations, corruption, actions of corruption, or three, also transnational organized crime. Those are the range of authorities that we can use to designate individuals connected to environmental crimes, and we have taken some actions which have been billed as sort of environmental crimes actions, but others, if you look at a major enforced sanctions action against Dan Gertler and his activities with the DRC. It might not have been billed necessarily as an environmental crime action, but it certainly has a huge impact when individuals are working with a corrupt government in the past to steal the mining wealth of a country. So we hope other countries beyond the United States can adopt similar authorities. Europe has adopted an equivalent to our global Magnitsky, or human rights and anti-corruption authority, but they haven't yet done it for corruption. They've sort of hived it off for human rights. So we hope other countries can adopt similar sanctions regimes. And lastly, since we're speaking in an anti-corruption conference, one of the biggest linkages between illegal wildlife trade and environmental crimes is corruption, which makes it all possible. And this is why we are very supportive of international efforts led at the FATF related to proper implementation of UNCAC and also effective asset recovery regimes, also pushing work on beneficial ownership registries. We're very supportive of those efforts, and domestically, as you heard from our National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, there's a lot we need to do at home to plug our own vulnerabilities, particularly related to beneficial ownership and also real estate that'll make it much harder for the U.S. to be used to launder a significant amount of environmental crimes proceeds. So thanks.
Scott, thank you so much. Before I ask our last panelist to intervene and maybe wrap a few threads together, I want to kind of preview for you all in the audience and also for the panelists a question I'm going to pose to you. We are here from a lot of different institutions and institutional perspectives. We have NGOs in the room. We have, as Scott was just pointing out, we have international organizations. We have national authorities. We have judiciary members, we have researchers, we have a number. So, and we're here talking about how we can pull these threads together and do better in this work, and do better financial investigation, do more of it, support more of it, in the places where it's still very difficult to have those capacities. So I want you to be thinking about what change you would like to see in how we work together. From your perspective, sitting in an NGO, sitting in government, wherever you are. So I'd like to have a conversation about that as we, after we wrap up the last contribution from Johanni Grossman, who leads the Basel Institute's Green Corruption Program, and who, as I said, is kind of the Basel Institute, and Johanni specifically have been the moving force behind this agenda in the Targeting Natural Resource Corruption Project and this panel here today. So Johanni, your team includes a number of financial investigators. You're doing support for financial investigations around the world. I guess I'd ask you, why is this such a focus for the Basel Institute? And, you know, from the perspective of the organizations and the territories and jurisdictions where you've been working, why aren't there more? And how do we get there from here?
Thanks, Liz, and thank you to the other panelists. There's little left for me to say, actually. I've been ticking off my points, so I have the unenviable task of trying to come up with something new after such brilliant speakers. Liz, to answer your first question, why are we focused on this issue? Well, there's two reasons. The Basel Institute engages on environmental corruption and has established the Green Corruption Program because we've seen in our corruption work that a huge number of cases that come our way are focused on the natural resources sector, either the extractives or the various commodities that we've talked about today already. But then we also see that corruption is an essential tool to hide the assets, the ill-gotten assets, and to undermine environmental and conservation policy. And that's particularly challenging, as I think we've seen very clearly at this conference, as more and more resources are being dedicated to this topic. And of course, the climate crisis becomes more and more acute. We really don't have any spare room left for undermining climate mitigation measures through corruption. I think that much has become pretty clear. So this is a high priority for us as an institution. As you mentioned, Liz, we have a team about 10 worldwide in 7 different countries, embedded in environmental agencies and prosecution services, advising on the development of cases through a follow-the-money approach. And of course, I say that as an achievement, but as Liz points out very, very clearly, there's very few cases like that. And so I thought perhaps in an effort of introspection, I would share a little bit why there aren't more cases despite very significant efforts, not just by us, of course, but by many other institutions, including many present here in the room. And the first challenge that we face repeatedly that requires really a significant effort to overcome is that us as anti-corruption and law enforcement officials coming to environmental agencies sometimes make the mistake that we think it's just another tool in their tool set that we're giving them. We'll train them how to do a financial investigation and then they'll just run with it. And that, I think, misrepresents the fact that that's not what those agencies are set up to do. That's not their job. Their job is to focus on conserving the environment, preserving natural resources, and establishing policies to that regard. Sometimes they have an enforcement function, but that enforcement function is also focused on the natural resources. It's not focused on money. So it's not as simple as just telling them, this is how you do it, here's a 3-day course, here's a certificate, off you go. It requires, in addition to continuously building that capacity, it also requires changing incentive structures for cases that are taken by those agencies, and it requires changing institutional approaches towards money. And not unimportantly, here we have many anti-corruption agencies. The flip side is also correct. Anti-corruption agencies don't focus on this issue enough because they are often looking at the amount of money directly involved in the crime, so the size of the bribe. The size of the bribe can be very big, can be very small. but that focus doesn't take into account the non-monetary impact on the environment that environmental corruption has, on biodiversity that it has. And so we have to realign the prioritization systems in anti-corruption agencies to make sure that case selection accounts for the negative impact on biodiversity in environmental corruption. The second point that I would make why it's so difficult is that every country's approach is entirely unique to this issue, right? We're so fortunate to have Gladys here, but as Liz mentioned, there's not a lot of wildlife courts around. So Michelle mentioned that a prosecutor will get one fish case perhaps in their career. And of course, in each country, things are very specialized in their approaches. The roles of prosecutors are very different in each country. Environmental agencies, some have enforcement authorities, some do not. Some have specialized environmental prosecutors, which is absolutely fantastic. But that's not very frequently the case, and where it is the case, they're just starting up. So we're talking about a very retail-oriented approach to capacity building. Everything has to be 100% customized, and that's a challenge, and that's very expensive. So in terms of program implementation, that's not always very attractive. I guess the final point that I would make here is I've been thinking all day about how to illustrate the challenge that this brings, and I'm gonna risk making an exercise-related analogy, which perhaps outs me as not the most sporty person in the world. But the approach, I think, to financial investigations and follow the money, where we all in this panel, but also in the many international commitments that the minister listed, we all get it, right? We all understand it's important, much like exercise. And yet, this is not something that we consistently focus on. So I don't know about you all, but I understand that I have to exercise every day. But it doesn't happen every day. Sometimes it happens once a week, sometimes less frequently. And so a financial investigation capacity, institutional expertise isn't really helped by doing it once a year, doing it once a month, because the know-how and the DNA of the institutions to start focusing on these things doesn't change. Just like going to the gym once a month and running 30 miles isn't really going to get you very far in terms of improving your health. So the consistency is really key. And that's what we've, I think, all been struggling with, despite the fact that we really stress the importance of defeating environmental crime consistently. When we look at the implementation level, there is still so many other priorities that distract from this. Thank you.
So Johanni has got us thinking about our own commitments and whether it is exercise of our bodies or exercise of our attention to environmental issues in the anti-corruption space and in the law enforcement space. I think that's a really great place for us to segue into some conversation. I posed to you in the audience and on the panel what one change, we'll try to keep our interventions brief so we can capture a number of them, but what change would you like to see in how we do this work, how we work together from the perspective of where you sit? And maybe speaking to the perspective of someone else who sits in this room, to strengthen our work on financial investigations. And I can't help but also think about Johanni's analogy in the sense of we also know that our long-term health is what's protected when we exercise regularly. We also know that our long-term health of this planet is posing an existential threat at the moment to our well-being. So how do we really flip this over in our priorities so that we have a place to keep exercising and keep arguing in the future? So I will first ask Sarah, our able Transparency International assistant here, who has the roving mic, to take a look. Is there anyone that'd like to start a contribution in the room? And then I'll also turn to some of our panelists to add to this. So I see a couple of hands toward the back. So I'll take one from the audience, and then I'll come up here if somebody wants to volunteer on the panel, and then go back.
Hi, my name is Siri Nelson. I'm the Executive Director at National Whistleblower Center. We have a designated program for wildlife whistleblowers. And when it comes to exercise, I want to share a tip that is highly effective, and that is whatever step you can take towards a regular practice is good, whether that's putting on your sneakers or your gym clothes one day and never actually making it to the gym. As long as the next time you try is another step forward, you're succeeding. So I feel like it's the same thing with combating wildlife trafficking. We work with wildlife whistleblowers who report about the pervasive trade of wildlife products online. How can we all work together to hold the tech industry accountable for the ways in which they facilitate this worldwide crime and track the financial proceeds that they're able to gain from engaging in this illicit activity?
Thanks very much. So whistleblowing and especially targeting the online trade. Point number one. Okay, now I'm going to come to who on the panel wants to volunteer a thought on this. Either that or else you will be voluntold. Michelle.
I'll say that, many of us have already mentioned a whole range of things as we were talking. In the fisheries space, and I'm sure that's true elsewhere as well, there is a general lack of transparency with regard to data, data collection, data reporting, making data public. And there is a newly formed coalition of NGOs that is trying to work to advocate with governments across the world to try to incorporate certain levels of transparency into their laws. These are basic things about the sorts of information for public goods that should be made, that should be collected, should be made public, but the reality is that they're really not. So this is one of the basics. Now, sure, there's a lot more other things to do too, but transparency of data would be a really good foundation. Thanks.
Okay, we're gonna do some more. I'll come to you next, Louise, after someone in the audience. We're gonna do some real brainstorming here, and then my abilities to pull it all together at the end will be tested to their limits. We have one in the back, I believe, Sarah? Yeah, great.
Hi, yes, way back here. Thank you all so much. This has been really inspiring, just knowing how many fantastic minds are on the problem. As someone who's worked both human trafficking and drug trafficking, it strikes me that if I've learned anything, it's that when you talk about those top of the food chain beneficial owners in these crime groups, all of these things, right, drugs, wildlife, arms, you name it, are really just a folder in a broader, diversified criminal portfolio. And to that end, with the point completely taken that there's a lot more to do in bringing data together under any one of those folders to begin with, I'd love to know what the panelists think about better efforts to combine data across those stovepipes so that there's a more comprehensive 360 picture about the financial trails of some of these big criminal fish in the global ecosystem. Thank you so much.
Thanks for that. And actually, I think I'm going to stick with that question just for a minute, this question of bringing data together across stovepipes. I don't know, Louise, if you're seeing any of that in the research that you do, or Scott, if there's a perspective you might have from Treasury on the data point, or maybe Ben as well. But let's start with Louise.
This is why I made the point about the importance of big-scale data analytics, because without doing this kind of research, you cannot see the patterns. And that's absolutely key. And there is very, very little sharing of data from online platforms. And I also think we talk about what can we do as citizens, because not all of you are professionals. This is the point when you talk about what is going on online, where people have gone for years with shareholder proposals to large corporations. Why aren't you, as a community, going and demanding or putting shareholder proposals that are debated at stockholder annual meetings on why you're not doing more to monitor this issue online? This is where citizen activism comes in, and we're thinking about the large-scale corporations that are involved in this, because the pressure needs to be increased. But I will also say that our research center has been working with one of these online platforms that is spending an absolute fortune, I mean hundreds of millions of dollars, trying to get rid of certain products from its website, counterfeits and others. And it is a much more complex issue because of the absolute tech savvy of these sellers, who know once they're taken down how to overcome obstacles. And this is where research comes in, because they talk about this and share this on discussion boards in for example, in Chinese. But as far as I know, they're not people reading and trying to figure out how to combat the way that the traffickers are outsmarting the platforms.
Thanks, Louise. Ben or Scott? Scott, yeah, please go ahead.
Just to pick up on a couple of the points that were made by the audience and my fellow speakers. One on whistleblowing. Thank you for raising that. Very few jurisdictions have basically incentives for individuals to serve as whistleblowers and have the protections. And again, FinCEN was asked as part of the AML Act to establish basically a whistleblowing program. And it's one of the very few AML CFT arms of any government that has that. And maybe that is a best practice for the rest of the world that could make a big difference. I would also agree that all the types of crimes that have been mentioned today, they do have a common cross-section with the biggest vulnerabilities in our financial system. And many countries in the world have beneficial ownership registries today. Very few have effective ones. Many do not have any at all. In the US, foremost among them, which is our biggest priority. But that can serve as a centralized hub to allow law enforcement to identify who's ultimately behind shell and front companies that can be used to launder the illicit proceeds. Also, in terms of data, it's a very tricky issue navigating the challenges between national security and data privacy and data protection. It's very fraught in every jurisdiction. I think a commonality, though, is the need for very effective financial intelligence units that oftentimes serves as the hub for financial intelligence and its support for law enforcement investigations and prosecutions. There's very different models around the world on how to do this. FinCEN has access to, receives this information, and law enforcement across the country, subject to a lot of confidentiality concerns, has access to it. Other jurisdictions, it's disseminated by the FIU, and they make the decision to share the information if they believe it's suspicious or not. But having an effective FIU. And lastly, information sharing among financial institutions often needs to be subject to some type of safe harbor protections, otherwise they may be subject to litigation in the jurisdictions. And the US was one of the first countries in the world to allow, under our AML framework, information sharing related to money laundering, terrorist financing, suspected transactions between different elements of the of financial institutions, and similarly from the government to the private sector. And we really see this as a best practice. Many other jurisdictions around the world in the last 5 years have established these public-private partnerships, but we think they're ripe to sort of have their growth accelerated, and probably illegal wildlife trafficking is a great case study of how information can be shared, at least inside national borders. It's much harder cross borders. FIU channels are one of them. Also, law enforcement through MLATs is another channel. But navigating these data privacy and protection impediments in many jurisdictions is not easy.
Thanks. Many more pieces of the puzzle there. And then Ben, I know there's just so many different ways you could take this question on too, from the work of traffic. So go.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm actually going to approach it from a single point. What can the online companies do? Funnily enough, I believe it's the same answer. What can the online companies do? What can governments do? What can law enforcement do? What can consumers do? What can financial institutions do? Risk assessments to try and look at what harm is coming from what we choose to do. One of the huge problems in the world, there's always more crime than there is resources to stop it. There's one of the things about humanity, we lay on lots of crime. There's never any shortage. So we need to pick what we respond to. And obviously I truly believe that natural resource crimes are critically important. I don't ask you to take my word for it. I ask you to go back to your organizations and consider what's your exposure to it. What does your organization, what role do you play in it? If someone works in a shop, what lines do you carry? Do they have sustainable supply chains? If you look at the Lacey Act, the EU timber regulations, both of them have incredibly high standards that they must demonstrate due care. The EU timber regulations say if there is more than a negligible risk, risk mitigation must take place. And my question would be, is that being done? And I don't believe it is. And if governments were to assess what is the harm from these things, what is the impact, how does it drive corruption, what are the money laundering values, we would see a response consummate with the threat. And I'm not necessarily saying that it has to be the highest threat. We face murders, we face kidnaps, we face rapes. And a lot of the countries that we're working in, where some of these things are originating from, but end markets are not necessarily there, don't have as many resources to apply to financial investigation. And so limited financial investigation resources are probably going to be applied to crimes where people are dying now. And we do see deaths from climate change, and we will see more. But I just think that if we could actually give it, evaluate it, assess it, understand it, and then respond appropriately to the threat, then we would be in a much, much better place.
You speak very convincingly. Thank you. I really want to get back to you, but these anxious people up here all have things to say, and they keep waving at me. So, Johanni.
I'll be quick, Liz. I just wanted to mention that one of the ways I think to break down the silos, just to come back to that point as well, is that there's a lot of commonality in these different types of crimes. And one of them is, of course, money laundering. If we're talking about financial investigations and financial crime, money laundering is almost always there. Yet we very rarely see money laundering charges brought in environmental crime cases. And so I just wanted to highlight there's actually a fantastic amount of work that's been done by FATF in this regard. Two really interesting reports, hopefully more to come, and lots of collaborations and ensuring that FIUs and others incorporate environmental crimes in the risk assessments related to money laundering. So there's definitely lots of grounds there as well.
One of the things I always learn when I'm doing these kinds of discussions with people who know much more about specific topics than I do is just how important it is for us to get even just the tip of the iceberg of what the issue is. So I sit in an environmental organization now, so does Michelle. We weren't really talking about these issues 5 years ago even. So, and some of us are still not expert, but we're starting to see the relevance and we're starting to get active in different ways. So really important also from our side on the conservation side. Another point, yes, here. Sarah, we have one just in the middle. Go ahead and raise your hand so she brings you the mic. Yeah.
Hi. Roger Kumar, Financial Action Task Force. I thought it was a great panel, and the kind of issues that you raised are very much practical issues that all of us are grappling with. But I think a forum like this really illuminates the different facets of the challenge that we are facing. And you can see we are dealing with wicked problems, and you can't have a single silver bullet that deals with all of these facets. So what is really required, I think, let me just talk about the mindset changes that I think need to be put in place. The first one is we are seeing from the scale of criminal enterprise how pernicious it is and the extent to which it covers different types of crime. And even when you have an entity that specializes in one category of crime, essentially they're making use of supply chains that may service different strands of criminal enterprise. So I think when we pull the information together, you really get the insights, deep insights into what's really happening, and that then informs everyone in the system. The second point I really wanted to make is this. I think we have to pay more attention to going after the proceeds of crime. And what is fundamental in going after the proceeds of crime is this. You are essentially depriving the criminals, the corrupt, of the funds that they then use to fund other types of crime and corruption and so on. And this is essentially a preventative strategy. It's such a fundamental preventative strategy, and I think we really need to focus on it a lot more. And the third point I wanted to make is really the importance of changing mindsets. One of you on the panel mentioned earlier that, I think it was Gladys, right, where you talked about the mindset of law enforcement traditionally has been, you are really happy when you make a huge seizure. That provides a beautiful photo opportunity. The investigators are standing in front of a table, and you've got all these exhibits, right? But that really is the first stage of actually dealing with the issue in front of you. You need to go upstream to go after the assets that have accumulated over years. And what you have is really an event, but you need to go after what's behind it. And only when we do that will we really make an impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj, so much. And it's really, you kind of paved the way for coming back to the local level, the level where these crimes are actually taking place. And Gladys, you shared with us that by the time a case makes it to the court, you can't produce miracles. That the case needs to be strong, the investigations need to have been done. If you could have your wish, what is it that would help you get the cases you need at the local level? And is it the mindset changes within the prosecutorial services? Is it citizen activism? Is it better international law regime? Tell us a little bit about what might help you do your job more effectively.
Thank you. So the kind of cases that we are talking about today are not the famous cases. Talking from a judge's point of view, these are not cases that we before used to like to listen to decide. These are cases that do not have a complainant, there's no victim, the victim will have died, the victim is not there, the relatives of the victim do not have the ability to make their way to the police to report a case, they don't have the ability to get the courtroom to say, she was my mother that was slaughtered, and yeah, so those are the cases that we are talking about. They're not famous. And therefore, if we only have a prosecutor following up on the case, and if their mindset is not very influenced, like he says, it's not influenced to reason to the direction of what is at stake when this crime goes on in a country, to understand that this is not a mere domestic problem, that if it happens in Uganda, it also affects, say, the United States of America, then we still have a problem. So now that these are not the famous cases that we would be talking about, and that the traffickers, those perpetrators that we are running after, are actually smarter than us. They're very smart. They know how to beat the process. They have a lot of money. They can corrupt the key stakeholders in the fight and go away unpunished. They know how to hide the wealth. They know how to hide the illicit wildlife products. Then we have to up our game. Business cannot anymore proceed as usual, because what we're dealing with today is complex. We have to reason very fast, we have to act very fast, we have to collaborate. We have to ensure that we have uniform mechanisms in all our countries, uniform in the sense that how we deal with this crime is not so different. We must make the earth where we live to not be an easy place for the traffickers or the ones who are dealing in this crime to run around. If they find Uganda insecure, they should also find country E, B, up to Z insecure. They should not be able to want to prefer to run to another country thinking that if they went to another one, they would be arrested and prosecuted rightly. So it calls for all our effort. And therefore, I would like to see all of us up. And those of us who have had a chance now to have our mindset influenced, and we have all this passion to help and influence others. This is not going to be achieved today, but I'm sure we can achieve it. Back home where we are, we know what is prevailing. And like someone said, we cannot say what applies in Uganda must apply in another country, and it must be that, because we have different prevailing circumstances. But even within our circumstances, we should endeavor as much as possible to do that which is right. The right small things we do, when put together, make a big impact, and that will help us to make the world a safer place for us and the wildlife that we are talking about today.
Thank you. I'm hesitant to add anything to that. But I will ask if anyone else dares to add anything to that, either from the audience. We have about 4 minutes left. Is there a point you'd love to make? Okay, then here, and then I'll also just ask if any of the panelists have any last points they'd like to make.
Hello, D.T. Cochran with Canadians for Tax Fairness. I really appreciated the point that Professor Shelley made about the intersection between the illicit activities and the legitimate organizations. Connected to that, and given that all of you are with government, working closely with government, connected to law enforcement, what about when you're working with groups who don't have the authority to identify this as a formal crime, don't have the power to prosecute what's happening? And I'm specifically thinking about Indigenous groups. So in Canada, the Canadian government bought a pipeline to build this expansion, and Indigenous nations along the route are opposing it, saying, these are our unceded, untreated territories. You don't have the right to build this. So in effect, the Canadian government is perpetuating a crime against these groups. So I'm wondering what your organizations are doing to support Indigenous people and other people who maybe aren't in the position to appeal to formal legal codes in declaring something to be an environmental crime. Thank you.
I'm going to turn that to the panel, and also for any other closing points that anyone wants to make. Yes, Michelle.
I can say a little bit about that. I know that WWF in a lot of the small island developing states, especially in the Pacific, they use community-based facilitators. When new rules, regulations, restrictions are being considered by the government at any level, they usually have lots of stakeholder participation to make sure that the voices of those who are going to be most directly impacted are considered, that they're considered legitimate, so that obviously that helps with compliance too. That's not a direct parallel to your situation, but it is a way that we try to incorporate customary knowledge and traditional knowledge when oftentimes that doesn't necessarily get a place at the table.
Anyone else for closing thoughts, something that has occurred to you, either in response to the audience or the other discussion here, that you'd like to close with? Yeah?
Just in close, there's much we can do together to address these problems. As I noted, when I come here, I think of my young child at that time, and a year and a half ago, in the midst of COVID, we went to Yosemite, and we hiked up to the top of Yosemite Falls, which was a mistake because it's a 2,800-foot gain. But by the end of that summer, some of the falls in Yosemite had run dry for the first time in thousands of years. And it saddens me that absent us working together, that may be the future of Earth, and that's why I hope today's session was a step in the right direction. But I did want to pick up quickly, Raja, on one of your points on if the fund flows are not stopped and the proceeds are not forfeited or seized, this is never going to stop. And that's why I think we appreciate all the work you're doing at the FATF on asset forfeiture. I think from the U.S. perspective, we'd like to see a lot of other countries endorse non-conviction-based basically seizures, which allows you to prosecute the stolen assets without prosecuting the predicate crime. There's many countries around the world that have this. In some countries, this is unconstitutional, but there's a lot more countries that could implement this into their law, and we think it would make a huge difference.
Thank you very much, Scott, for mentioning NCBF. Actually, I've been keeping track of all these ideas that I wanted to mention, but the NCBF has been actually very useful for us in cases, especially in Peru, related to environmental criminals. So I'm a big fan of it. The other point I was going to make as a final is that the whole point of working together. So Liz, in fact, has some postcards there, and there's some postcards out there that highlight particularly this point. So we launched this practitioners forum yesterday, and one of the specific focuses of the practitioners forum is bringing financial investigators and prosecutors focused on environmental crimes together from across the globe. It is my deep hope that they will find some value in communicating with each other, because they're typically very alone in their own agencies, right? Sort of one or two people in an agency that focus on this, and as I said before, the DNA of the agency isn't set up to support them. So our hope is that with this working group we can connect them with each other and have them build on the lessons learned as they implement and encourage the conduct of Follow the Money approaches.
Thanks, Juhani. I will, just repeat what Juhani was saying, not just about financial investigations, but if you're interested in how conservation and anti-corruption can work more effectively together, come to the embassy room, get your lunch, come to the embassy room. We'll start that discussion probably a little after 12:30. Pick up one of these. You can scan the QR code and sign up to the mailing list as well. And then it just remains to me to thank the Honorable Minister for her remarks at the beginning, and to Liechtenstein for their support of this effort, and Juhani for organizing us, and all of our panelists, and to you for your participation as well. Thank you very much, and be inspired.